I asked all of you which PC component you thought was the most susceptible to depreciation. If you don't know what that word is, definition's right here. And the answers were kind of all over the place, which I suppose is a good thing in a way. We can take time to review comments and discuss each in detail. Think of this as a 2020 PC depreciation guide, if you will. Stay with me. By this point, you've probably seen our original ad for Thermal Grizzly's Carbonite pads. They're clean, peace-of-mind replacements for traditional thermal paste, and best of all, you'll never have to replace them. But did you also know that you can buy Carbonite pads in different sizes for various processors? They even make a giant 51x68mm pad for Threadripper. I highly recommend Carbonite pads, and you can learn more by clicking the link below. So I posted this tweet on August 13th, 2020, and by the 17th had well over 200 comments relating to it, but I'll try to pull replies that bring up interesting points and to go on from there. Now, I don't have a tally of who voted for which component, but I will say many of you said that the GPU, or in broader terms, the graphics card, experienced the most depreciation. Ricardo says, well, it really depends. In my case, I would say the graphics card, since I'm typically upgrading that every 2 to 3 years, while for example, my CPU lasts around 5 years, etc. And I totally understand that approach. Games evolve so freaking fast, and so too do the demands from them. Cards that are only a couple of generations old actually really do start to show their age, despite what some might tell you. And on top of this, drivers tend to phase out those older models on the software side of things and almost force you into something newer and shinier. Many look at the side effect as a marketing tactic, but either way you slice it, graphics cards are probably one of the quickest depreciating items on the list from both performance and price perspectives. Consider the following. GTX 1070s and 1080s tanked in value after launch. So too did RX 480s, 580s, Vega cards from Team Red. There's so much evidence to back this up, and every subsequent product launch seems to compound the issue. In particular, Pascal cards got hit pretty freaking hard. That's good for the buyer, not so much for the seller. So if I had to ballpark it, I would say graphics cards lose close to 50% of their values within at least the first 2 years, by which time a new generation typically releases. But if there's one good thing we can extract from this, it's that graphics cards are relatively easy to swap. They don't involve entire platform upgrades, just DDU, clip out, clip in, and install new drivers. One other thing to note, graphics cards after their initial depreciation drops, which they tend to be pretty aggressive, don't really move much more in price after that. So GTX 780s, 980 Ti's, even 1070s now, they really haven't gone up or down in price since the initial blow that they took after launch. Though these cards I expect will be around $200 for several years. But another PC component many of you answered in the tweet was storage drives, and I can totally get behind this one as well. Look, spinning drives in particular, they take huge hits on the used market, and for good reason, IMO. They're more sensitive to sudden movements and vibrations, meaning you've no guarantee regarding the drive's remaining lifespan. How much longer are those platters gonna spin? Who freaking knows? And on top of that, both SSDs and hard disk drives could contain sketchy viruses and files that weren't properly deleted by the previous owner that you're not supposed to have access to. I know that's kind of fear-mongering, but you never know. I don't take chances like that. As such, I always tell my viewers to stay away from them on the used market. At the end of the day, you could only save about 20 bucks or so going used versus new per terabyte of hard disk space. And that to me is just it's not worth it. Spend the extra 20 bucks for the peace of mind. And since SSDs can only write a finite number of times before dying, it's best to err on the side of caution in that respect as well and buy a new one with a solid warranty. You'll thank me later. The next most popular PC component suggested on the Twitter post was CPUs. And this one, it's a bit wishy-washy from my perspective, but only because it's generation and SKU dependent. For example, Brian over at Techia City points out that Core i3s have taken massive hits as of late on account of Ryzen's success. Totally understandable there. I get it, Core i3s are not very appealing anymore. I mean, just the Core i3 brand at this point is kind of out the window. But Core i7s and Core i9s more recently seem to be almost immune to depreciation, and there are many reasons why. The most obvious is probably just the name conventions. The Core i7 and Core i9 brands carry a lot of weight, and many circles who aren't necessarily generation dependent seem to just want to buy these up in bulk. Many workloads actually to this day favor Intel systems. That's just how it is. It is still a thing. And since Intel was dominant in the years leading up to the release of Zen architecture, those generations in particular, the older ones like Ivy Bridge, Sandy Bridge, and Haswell, hold a certain reputation. reputation. I don't agree with the value rationale, but it's the way things are. I mean, why else would used Core i7 4790Ks be listed en masse at 200 USD? AMD CPUs, on the other hand, a bit more price sensitive. Not only was the leap between Piledriver and Zen massive, rendering all of those older chips borderline useless, although they do have a few use cases, but Ryzen's so cheap it's difficult to ignore. But AMD's been pushing out newer and newer CPUs since the release of Zen, essentially rendering the older Zen SKUs obsolete. And look, I'm using that term loosely because there remains insane value, undeniably, in something like a Ryzen 5 2600 for just over $100. I mean, they're selling them for $120 new, right? So that doesn't really help the used market at all, at least from the seller's perspective again. And at this point, AMD's kind of become a bit like McLaren in the car world. They're always releasing something bigger and better year after year, and that results in crazy amounts of depreciation for the previous generations of cars, which are still phenomenal cars. Granted, reliability is with McLaren's, reliability and McLaren don't really belong in the same sentence. But anyway, even if those cars had originally cost over 300 grand, they're worth maybe 2/3 of that now, and only after a few thousand miles of use. It's because there's something bigger and better on the horizon. It's a bit like tech in general, but with McLaren in particular, it's pretty bad. And I would say AMD to an extent as well. It's a good thing that AMD's giving us something new, even if it's just a rehash once or twice here or there. It's nice to see those things, but it's bad news for those who are on older systems, maybe using older CPU architecture, and who want to kind of get the most out of the resale values there. You're just not going to see them if there's something much better for a few more dollars. I mean, 20, 30 bucks, I'm gonna spend extra to get a new one versus a used one. That's just how I approach it. I imagine that's how many buyers do as well. Now, another component a few of you pointed out in the thread was RAM, and I feel like RAM was very timeline specific. Price fixing from a few years ago resulted in a huge spike in prices over original MSRPs, and that means that anyone who bought into a new platform during that time absorbed many of those hiked costs up front. And to those people, yes, RAM has depreciated significantly, but the term depreciation involves a decline from original MSRP. That's how I look at it, and if we're willing to overlook this exception, RAM largely has not depreciated much at all. In fact, even locally, I can find 16 gigs of 3200 megahertz DDR4 listed for near MSRP, if not exactly at MSRP. If you live near a Best Buy or a Micro Center, that might help drive used prices down a bit in your area, but by and large, I don't really see RAM as a component that really tanks in value. And another thing about RAM is it's generation dependent, right? So DDR4 is DDR4. It doesn't matter if you bought it in the beginning or at the end. Yeah, you have tighter timings, higher frequencies, but at the end of the day, it's gonna do the exact same thing if it was bought 2 years ago and if it was bought today. There's really no change in how it performs, it just does what it's supposed to do. Even DDR3, comparatively, is pretty expensive, and it's because that one's in fixed supply, so I largely disagree with those who are saying that RAM depreciated like crazy, with the exception again being price fixing, but I think that's something we need to overlook if we want to look at depreciation as a whole. Lastly, the one I think depreciates the most, that's right, the most, more so than graphics cards, is cases. Several of you pointed this one out, and at first I hadn't really crossed my mind, I'll admit. I was thinking electronics, right? To me, electronics tank in value almost immediately after they're launched in general, but cases, yeah, I could get behind that. I mean, think about a used case. There are two primary reasons why those would tank in value on a site like eBay. New models are launching, it seems like every few months, and shipping cases is a freaking nightmare. To the first point, yes, there are many case models launched every year, and even small revisions within the same year can render older models practically worthless. This is a bit of an extreme example, but this comes to mind right away. The Cooler Master H500P, the original high airflow version, right? It's big quotes there, had a completely sealed off front panel. And after aggressive reviewer feedback, the company quickly released the follow-up mesh version. So who wants the original anymore? Especially if you marketed that one as the high airflow version with the huge fans up front. That's right, only the folks who aren't keeping up with modern case trends will be the ones to buy the obsolete version. They don't know that it's obsolete. I mean, maybe they just think it looks cool. But this ties into the second point as well. Say he or she wants to buy a used H500P. One's on eBay for 50 bucks. Okay, that's really not bad for that case, but then the seller wants 50 bucks to cover shipping. Well, okay, but at that point, you could buy a new H500P mesh a better performing variant for almost the same price and pay maybe at most a few extra bucks for shipping, although in many cases, especially in Amazon's case, you don't have to pay extra for shipping at all. This forces case sellers to lower prices even further to the point where a majority of the sale price accounts for shipping, at which point the entire purpose of selling the case to recover some of the initial expense goes out the window because your margins, your shipping margins are so freaking high. It does not help that cases are generally the largest things by far that go into a PC build. Then you've got to repackage it, drive down to the local UPS store, wait in line. You'll find that cases are often more trouble than they're worth to resell, unless the case is still relatively new or you can get someone to meet you locally somewhere. Most of the time, shipping is just not a good idea when it comes to reselling cases. And on top of that, most used cases don't include all the original screws. Some people lose the screws, they just don't include them at all. They won't even mention that they're not included. You get the case, you find out that it doesn't have what you need to secure the motherboard in place or the graphics card, maybe it's missing PCIe slot covers, who freaking knows. Now, just for fun, I figured I would touch on the product that I feel is the most immune to depreciation, and in my opinion, that's gotta be motherboards. From my experience shopping online, looking for a used motherboard on eBay is just a nightmare. For whatever reason, these things just do not tank in value. Even AMD boards hold quite a bit of value long term, and heck, to that extent, some Intel boards are actually listed for more than their original MSRPs. Yeah, I am looking at you, X79. But anyway, I hope this video at least opens up a bit of dialogue in the comment section. I have listed a few eBay searches for those interested in buying used, as well as some new products we may have showcased in this video. If you guys enjoyed this one, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I will catch you in the next one. My name's Greg. Thanks for learning with me.